Daniel Mercer was 31 years old when his father grounded him, not metaphorically, not emotionally, actually grounded him. It happened at a family gathering on a quiet Sunday afternoon, in front of 23 relatives, 2 caterers and one extremely confused estate lawyer holding a leather briefcase. And the worst part? Daniel hadn't even done anything wrong. At least, not the way his father saw it. But the moment the lawyer opened Grandma Evelyn's sealed envelope, everything changed. And suddenly the one person in the room who'd spent his entire life being treated like a disappointment was the only one who could legally control $4.7 million. Daniel Mercer had spent most of his life being the family's quiet embarrassment, not because he was irresponsible, not because he was reckless, but because he refused to follow the Mercer family blueprint. Attorneys and financial advisors. Daniel's grandfather had built Mercer Financial Group from a single office into a regional firm that managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. His father, Richard Mercer, had turned it into a polished empire of tax attorneys, wealth managers, and corporate advisors. His older sister Allison was already a senior partner at 34. His younger brother Jason worked in mergers and acquisitions for a private equity firm. Every Mercer had a job title that sounded impressive at charity galas. Every Mercer wore tailored suits. Every Mercer understood asset portfolios before they understood how to drive. Except Daniel. Daniel restored furniture. Old furniture, the kind most people threw away. While his siblings negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts in glass offices overlooking the city skyline, Daniel spent his days in a workshop that smelled like cedar dust, varnish, and old wood. He fixed antique chairs, repaired dressers, restored heirloom tables that families thought were beyond saving, and to Daniel, there was something deeply satisfying about it. Taking something forgotten, something broken, and bringing it back to life. But to Richard Mercer, it was humiliating. "You went to college for business administration," Richard had once said, staring at Daniel like he'd personally insulted the family name. "And now you fix chairs." "Other antique restorations," Daniel had replied calmly. "Our chair." And somehow, it had never ended. The Mercer estate sat on 12 acres outside the city, a sprawling colonial mansion with tall white columns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a driveway that curved dramatically toward a circular fountain. The kind of house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury magazine. Every year, the Mercer family hosted 2 large gatherings there: Christmas and Grandma Evelyn's birthday. But this year was different, because Grandma Evelyn had passed away 3 weeks earlier at the age of 92. And this gathering wasn't just a memorial dinner. It was the reading of her estate documents. Daniel stood near the back patio, holding a glass of iced tea he hadn't touched. Relatives milled around the garden. His cousins talked loudly about investments. His sister Allison laughed beside her husband, a tax attorney who somehow managed to look smug even while eating shrimp cocktail. Jason stood near the fountain checking stock prices on his phone. Everyone looked polished, successful, important. And Daniel stood there in a simple button-down shirt and jeans that still had faint wood dust near the cuffs. He didn't mind. He never had. But he knew his father noticed. His father always noticed. Daniel?" The voice came from behind him, sharp, controlled, disappointed. Richard Mercer stood there in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his posture rigid as always. Even at a family gathering, even in his own backyard, he looked exactly the way he did in every business magazine photo: tall, silver-haired, immaculately composed, and perpetually unimpressed. "Your sister and brother are helping Mr. Callahan prepare for the estate reading," Richard said. Daniel nodded. "Oh, that's good." Richard studied him, slowly, carefully, like an investor evaluating a failing company. "You could have worn something more appropriate." Daniel glanced down at himself. "It's a family gathering. It's an estate proceeding." Daniel sighed quietly. "Same conversation, different." "Your grandmother valued professionalism," Richard continued. "She valued kindness too." Richard's jaw tightened. "A kindness doesn't run financial institutions." Daniel didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that silence ended these conversations faster than logic, but Richard wasn't finished. "You're 31 years old, Daniel." "Yes. And yet you still behave like a college student who hasn't decided what to do with his life." "I restore antiques. You sandwood." Daniel took a sip of his iced tea. You sometimes, Richard exhaled slowly, the sound of a man exhausted by someone else's failure. "You could still join Mercer Financial," Richard said. "We've had this conversation. You'd start in operations. I'm not interested. You could build a real career." Daniel looked at him, calm, patient. "Why already have one?" Richard stared at him, and for a moment, there was genuine disbelief in his eyes. Like Daniel had just claimed the sky was green. "You repair discarded furniture in a warehouse. It's a workshop. You barely make enough to maintain an apartment." Daniel shrugged. "We like my apartment." Richard looked toward the house, where relatives laughed under the shade of the garden canopy. Then back at Daniel. "You know what people say." Daniel smiled slightly. "I try not to." "They think I failed you?" Daniel blinked. That part surprised him. Richard continued quietly. "They think I couldn't guide my own son." Daniel set his glass down. "That sounds like their problem." Richard's voice hardened. "No, Daniel. It's mine." The tension between them hung in the warm summer air, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard said something Daniel hadn't heard since he was 15 years old. "We're grounded." Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "You're grounded. I'm 31. You're still my son." Daniel stared at him, unsure if this was a joke. "It was." "You embarrassed this family again last week," Richard said coldly. Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" The charity gala." "You mean when I donated the restored piano?" Richard nodded sharply. "You arrived in work boots. They were clean. It was inappropriate." Daniel rubbed his temples. Dad, it was a charity auction. You made us look provincial." Daniel laughed softly. He couldn't help it. And that laugh was exactly the wrong reaction. Richard's face hardened. "You will stay here for the remainder of the afternoon." Daniel blinked again. "You're grounding me?" "Oh yes. At a family gathering." "Yes." Daniel looked around the garden. His cousins were watching now, trying not to stare, trying not to laugh, trying not to make eye contact. And suddenly Daniel understood. This wasn't discipline, it was humiliation. Before he could respond, a calm voice interrupted. "Richard." Everyone turned. Standing near the garden entrance was a tall elderly man in a charcoal suit holding a leather briefcase. Thomas Callahan, Grandma Evelyn's estate attorney. He'd worked with the Mercer family for 40 years, and judging by the look on his face, he'd heard enough. Perhaps we should begin the reading," Callahan said. Richard straightened immediately. Professional mask back in place. "Yes, of course." Relatives gathered under the garden canopy. Chairs scraped softly across the stone patio. Conversations quieted. The estate reading was about to begin. Daniel almost didn't sit down. But something about Callahan's expression made him stay. Callahan opened the leather briefcase carefully. Inside were several sealed envelopes, official documents, legal folders, and one thick envelope with Daniel's name written across the front. Daniel frowned slightly. That was strange. His father noticed too. "So," Richard said confidently, addressing the group. "My mother's estate will be divided according to the trust arrangements she finalized years ago." Everyone nodded. This wasn't expected to be dramatic. Most of Grandma Evelyn's wealth had already been distributed through long-term family trusts. The house, investment, art, everything had been planned carefully. Callahan adjusted his glasses. "Mostly correct," he said. Richard frowned slightly. "Mostly?" Callahan looked around the family, then down at the thick envelope. Mrs. Evelyn Mercer amended one section of her estate 6 months before her passing. That caused murmurs. Richard's voice sharpened. "I wasn't informed of any amendment." She requested confidentiality. Richard didn't like that. And what he said next made the entire Mercer family fall silent. "This trust," Callahan said calmly, "contains $4.7 million. Gasps rippled across the garden. Richard stared. "Who is it assigned to?" Callahan looked up, directly at Daniel, and said one sentence that would change everything. "It belongs solely to Daniel Mercer." To Daniel Mercer. For a moment, no one spoke. Not Allison, not Jason, not Richard Mercer. 23 relatives sat frozen beneath the garden canopy, staring at Thomas Callahan like he had just announced the sky was falling. And Daniel Mercer sat there wondering if he had heard correctly. $4.7 million. Assigned solely to him. The quiet disappointment of the Mercer family. The man who affixed chairs. Richard was the first person to move. His chair scraped sharply against the stone patio as he stood. "That's not possible." Callahan calmly folded his hands. "It is." Richard's voice sharpened immediately. My mother structured her estate years ago. Every trust allocation was finalized." "Yes," Callahan said. "Except for one." The garden erupted into murmurs. Jason stared at Daniel like he had suddenly become a different species. Richard looked at Daniel slowly, then back at Callahan. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that my mother secretly created a multi-million-dollar trust for my son." "That is correct," Richard laughed. "But there was no humor in it. My mother would never make a decision like that without consulting me." Callahan raised one eyebrow slightly. She did." Daniel finally spoke. "Are you sure there isn't some mistake?" Every head turned toward him. It wasn't the reaction the family expected. If anything, Daniel looked more confused than anyone else. Callahan opened the envelope again and removed a notarized document. This trust was signed and witnessed 6 months ago." He placed the paper on the table. Mrs. Evelyn Mercer was very clear about the beneficiary." Richard leaned forward sharply. "And that is?" Callahan looked directly at Daniel again. Daniel Mercer." The murmurs grew louder. One cousin actually choked on his drink. Allison leaned toward Jason. "Did you know about this?" Jason shook his head slowly. "No." Richard's voice cut through the noise. "This is absurd." Callahan remained calm. "The documentation is legally binding. My mother was 92 years old." Yes. She may not have understood what she was signing." Callahan's expression hardened slightly. "Why was present when she signed it?" Richard crossed his arms. "And you're telling me she chose him?" He gestured toward Daniel. The word to him landed like an accusation. Callahan nodded once. She did." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The attention in the garden had become overwhelming. 23 relatives staring at him, some shocked, some confused, some openly irritated. His cousin Brian whispered loudly to someone beside him, "The furniture guy?" Daniel pretended not to hear. Allison finally spoke. "There must be conditions attached." Callahan looked down at the document again. There are." Richard seized on that immediately. "Of course there are." His voice had regained confidence. "My mother was extremely practical." He looked at Daniel. "This is probably some kind of incentive clause." Jason nodded. Maybe it requires him to join the family firm," someone else suggested, "or complete a financial management program." Richard smiled faintly. "That would make sense." Callahan said nothing. Richard leaned forward. "Well?" The lawyer closed the folder slowly. "The trust does contain one condition." Richard relaxed slightly. "There we are." "What is it?" Allison asked. Callahan adjusted his glasses. "Daniel must remain exactly who he is." The garden fell silent again. Richard blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Callahan repeated it. The trust becomes fully accessible only if Daniel continues living the life he currently lives." Jason frowned. That doesn't make any sense." Callahan read directly from the document. Specifically, Daniel Mercer must not join Mercer Financial Group or any affiliated entity controlled by Richard Mercer. The words hit the table like a dropped glass. Richard froze. "Excuse me," Callahan continued. "The trust will be void if Daniel becomes financially dependent on Mercer family assets or employment." Allison leaned forward slowly. "So he can't work for Dad." "That is correct." Jason shook his head. "Why would Grandma write that?" Callahan closed the document. She explained her reasoning in a separate letter. Richard's voice was dangerously calm now. "I would like to hear it." Callahan hesitated. "This letter is addressed to Daniel." Richard's jaw tightened. "Read it." Callahan looked at Daniel. "Would you prefer to read it privately?" Daniel glanced around the garden, at the tense faces, at his father's rigid posture. Then back at Callahan. "You can read it." Callahan nodded slowly, and opened the letter. "Dear Daniel," he began. "If you're hearing this letter, it means the rest of the family is sitting nearby pretending they understand everything." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the garden. Richard did not laugh. Callahan continued. "I know how your father sees you." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. Richard believes success only exists inside a balance sheet. Richard's expression darkened. "But I've been watching you for years." Daniel looked down at the table. Callahan kept reading. "I watched you repair my dining room table when everyone else said it was beyond safe." Allison glanced at Jason. Neither of them had known about that. "I watched you spend 6 hours fixing Mrs. Hernandez's rocking chair and refuse payment because she reminded you of your mother." Daniel remembered that. He hadn't realized Grandma knew. Watched you restore broken things people had given up on. Callahan paused. Then read the next line slowly. And Daniel, you have spent your entire life surrounded by people who believe broken things should simply be replaced. The garden was completely silent now. Callahan turned the page. So I decided to leave my fortune to the one Mercer who understands the value of repair. Daniel swallowed. Callahan finished the final paragraph. This money is not a reward. It is protection. Because I know your father will spend the rest of his life trying to convince you that the life you've built isn't good enough. Richard stood abruptly. That's enough. But Callahan read the last line anyway. Daniel, if you ever begin to believe him, the trust disappears. He closed the letter, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said. Richard looked at Daniel slowly, then at Callahan. My mother left nearly $5 million. His voice trembled with controlled anger. But to prevent my son from working for me, Callahan nodded. That is essentially correct. Richard laughed again. Short, cold, unbelievable. Jason leaned toward Allison. This is insane, Allison whispered back. She always liked Daniel. Jason frowned. Liking someone doesn't mean giving them millions. Daniel finally spoke again, quietly. Minversk for this. Richard turned toward him instantly. Oh, I know. His voice was icy now. You wouldn't have the initiative. The insult landed cleanly. Several relatives shifted awkwardly. But Richard wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Daniel. You see what she's done. Daniel looked up calmly. What? She's rewarded mediocrity. Daniel didn't respond. Richard gestured toward the house. This family built an empire. His voice rose. We built something extraordinary. He looked back at Dan. Now my mother leaves the largest private trust to the one person who contributed absolutely nothing. The words echoed across the garden. Daniel held his father's gaze, and for the first time that afternoon, he smiled slightly. He said softly, I fixed her dining table. Several cousins snorted before they could stop themselves. Richard's face turned red. And at that moment, Thomas Callahan quietly added one final sentence. There is one more detail. Richard turned sharply. What now? Callahan opened another document. The trust becomes active immediately. Jason leaned forward. What does that mean? Callahan looked at Daniel. It means as of today. He paused. Daniel Mercer is the majority owner of the Mercer estate property. Richard's expression changed completely. What? Callahan nodded. Your mother transferred the land rights into the trust as well. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. You're telling me, Callahan finished the sentence for him, that Daniel now owns the house you're standing in. The words hung in the air like thunder that hadn't finished rolling. Daniel now owned the house, not metaphorically, not someday in the future, legally, immediately, the Mercer estate, the 12 acres of land, the colonial mansion, the fountain, everything. Richard Mercer stared at Thomas Callahan as if the lawyer had just confessed to a crime. That's impossible. Callahan didn't react. It is fully documented. Richard's voice rose. This house belongs to Mercer Financial Holdings. Callahan shook his head calmly. It belonged to Evelyn Mercer. He tapped the document gently. And now it belongs to the trust. And the trust belongs to Daniel? Yes. Allison looked like she had swallowed a lemon. You're saying my brother owns this house? That is correct. Jason looked at Daniel. You own Dad's house? Daniel blinked. Ye didn't know she even could do that. Callahan folded the documents neatly. She could. And she did. The garden felt smaller now. The same relatives who had ignored Daniel 30 minutes earlier were suddenly studying him with new interest. Some curious, some calculating, some quietly irritated, but Richard Mercer looked something else entirely. Furious. Not loud fury, not explosive anger, the controlled icy kind that lived behind clenched teeth. You manipulated her. Daniel blinked. What? Richard pointed at him. You filled her head with nonsense. They barely talked about money with Grandma. You convinced her this life of yours meant something. Daniel stared at him. Dad, I restore furniture. Would play in a workshop. Okay. You humiliated this family. Daniel looked around the garden, the house, the fountain, the estate. Then back at his father. And now I own the humiliation apparently. A couple cousins snorted again. Richard shot them a glare that shut them up instantly. Allison leaned toward Callahan. I want to see the documentation. Callahan handed her the folder. She scanned the pages quickly. The more she read, the more her expression changed. Jason leaned over her shoulder. It's airtight. Richard stepped closer. Let me see. Allison handed him the document. Richard read it, slowly, carefully. Every line, every clause, every signature. Then he stopped at the bottom, and his eyes narrowed. What is this? Callahan already knew. That, he said calmly, is the reason your mother trusted Daniel. Richard looked up sharply. What does that mean? Callahan opened another envelope. Inside was a smaller sealed letter. This was also written by Evelyn Mercer. He looked at Daniel. She asked that it be read to the entire family. Richard scoffed. Oh, wonderful. Callahan broke the seal, and began reading. Before anyone complains about Daniel receiving this trust, the letter began. I want to tell you something none of you know. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. Callahan continued. 5 years ago I made a mistake. Richard frowned. What mistake? Callahan ignored the interruption and kept reading. I invested a large portion of my private savings into a development project. Allison's eyebrows lifted. Richard's voice cut in. What development project? Callahan kept reading. Richard convinced me it was safe. The garden grew quiet. Very quiet. According to him, the land would triple in value. Jason glanced at his father. Richard's jaw tightened. Callahan continued. But the project failed. Allison's eyes widened slightly. Callahan read the next line slowly. I lost almost everything. A murmur swept through the relatives. Richard stepped forward sharply. That's not accurate. Callahan didn't stop reading. I didn't tell anyone, the letter continued. Not my children, not my grandchildren, because I was embarrassed. But Daniel found out. Every head turned toward him again. Daniel blinked. I did. Callahan nodded slightly, then kept reading. Daniel came to visit me the day after the investment collapsed. He didn't know about the money. He only came because he noticed my dining room table had cracked again. Daniel remembered that day. The table had split along an old seam. He had brought clamps and wood glue. He'd spent half the afternoon repairing it. Callahan continued reading. He worked quietly for hours while I sat in the kitchen pretending everything was fine. Eventually he asked why I hadn't eaten lunch. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Callahan read on. I told him the truth. Not because I planned to, but because Daniel asked the kind of questions that make honesty easy. We expected him to give me financial advice. After all, everyone in this family thinks like investors. But Daniel didn't. The next line made several relatives glance at each other. He asked me something no one else ever had. Callahan looked up briefly. Then read it. Grandma, do you want me to fix the table first or the problem? Jason frowned. What does that even mean? Callahan continued reading. Daniel spent the next 2 weeks helping me quietly sell several antiques I owned. Daniel blinked. Oh, he remembered that. He had helped her photograph some old furniture pieces, list them online, find collectors. He hadn't thought much about it. Callahan continued. He refused to take a single dollar. Allison whispered softly. You never told us about that. Daniel shrugged. You never asked. Callahan read the next paragraph. Those antiques recovered almost $200,000. Your grandmother owned several rare pieces, the letter continued. But more importantly, Daniel never treated my mistake like a financial disaster. Lee treated it like a broken chair. Several relatives looked confused. Callahan read the next line slowly. He simply asked how we could repair it. Richard's voice cut through the silence. That doesn't justify giving him millions. Callahan turned the page. We're right. Everyone looked at him. Then he read the next line. What justified it? Was what Daniel said the day we finished fixing the table. Daniel frowned. I don't remember saying anything important. Callahan read the sentence. You told me something I'll never forget. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What? Callahan looked at the paper, and read it aloud. Grandma, money's like wood. People panic when it cracks. They just need someone patient enough to repair them. The garden was completely silent. Even Richard didn't interrupt. Callahan continued reading the letter. In that moment, I realized something. This family is full of people who know how to build wealth. But Daniel is the only one who knows how to rebuild it. Allison stared at her brother. Jason looked thoughtful for the first time. Several cousins looked uncomfortable. Richard looked furious. Callahan read the final paragraph. So I placed my fortune with the one Mercer who understands the difference between value and price. He folded the letter carefully. And that, Callahan said quietly, is why your grandmother trusted Daniel. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Jason finally said what everyone was thinking. So Dad, he glanced around the estate. Technically Daniel owns the house now. Richard looked at his son, then slowly turned back toward Daniel. And for the first time all afternoon, he didn't look angry, he looked worried. Because suddenly, the son he had spent 31 years dismissing, was the most powerful person in the family. The silence after the letter ended didn't last long. Richard Mercer had never been a man who accepted losing control, and right now, control was slipping through his fingers like sand. He folded the estate documents slowly and handed them back to Thomas Callahan. This trust, Richard said carefully, will be reviewed by my attorneys. Callahan nodded calmly.
That is your right.
Richard's voice sharpened. And if there are irregularities, Richard ignored the interruption. We will challenge it. Jason leaned forward. You can do that? Richard didn't look at him. Of course we can. Callahan adjusted his glasses. You can attempt to. Richard stared at him. Attempt? Callahan nodded once. Your mother anticipated that possibility. A few cousins exchanged glances. Richard's patience was thinning. What does that mean? Callahan opened the folder again. It means the trust was constructed with several legal protections. Richard crossed his arms. Such as, Callahan turned the document slightly. Such as a non-contestation clause. Jason frowned. What's that? Allison answered before the lawyer could. It means if we challenge the trust and lose. She stopped reading. Jason blinked. And? She looked up slowly. We forfeit everything else. Several relatives gasped. Jason looked at his father. You mean? Allison finished the sentence. If Dad challenges the trust and the court upholds it, the rest of Grandma's estate gets redistributed. Jason blinked again. To who? Callahan looked at Daniel. Also Daniel. The garden exploded into murmurs. Richard's head snapped toward the lawyer. That's absurd. Callahan's voice stayed calm. It is legally enforceable. Jason whispered to Allison. But that loses, Daniel gets everything? Allison nodded slowly. Yes. Richard stood very still. His mind was clearly racing now. For the first time that afternoon, he wasn't reacting emotionally. He was calculating. He turned slowly toward Daniel, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was softer now, controlled, reasonable. The tone Richard Mercer used when negotiating million-dollar deals. Daniel. Daniel looked up. Yes? Richard walked closer. The guests watched carefully. This situation has clearly created tension. Daniel nodded slightly. One word for it. Richard forced a thin smile. But we're family. Daniel didn't answer. Richard continued. I'm sure your grandmother meant well. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You sound surprised. Richard ignored that. But the reality is that managing an estate like this requires experience. Daniel said nothing. Richard gestured toward the house. This property alone requires hundreds of thousands annually in maintenance. Callahan cleared his throat. Actually, Richard raised a hand. Thank you, Thomas. Callahan fell silent again. Richard continued speaking to Dan. There are taxes, insurance, staff salaries, property upkeep. Daniel nodded. Sounds expensive. It is. Richard leaned slightly closer. Which is why it would make sense to place the estate under professional management. Daniel understood immediately. You mean Mercer Financial? Richard smiled. Exactly. Jason leaned back in his chair. Oh, Allison sighed quietly. Daniel leaned back. So let me make sure I understand. Richard nodded. You want to manage the trust, temporarily, and the estate, professionally. Daniel tapped the table thoughtfully. And I'd still own it, of course. Daniel tilted his head. And Mercer Financial would charge management fees. Richard's smile remained perfectly calm. As any professional firm would. Daniel looked toward Callahan. How much do firms usually charge? Callahan answered immediately. Between 2 and 3% annually. Daniel blinked. Of the total assets? Yes. Daniel did the math quickly. $4.7 million. Plus the estate property, plus investments. That's over $100,000 a year. Richard spread his hands. For professional management, Daniel nodded slowly. By the same firm that lost Grandma's development investment? The words landed hard. Jason's eyebrows shot up. Allison looked at the ground. Richard's smile disappeared. That was a market fluctuation. Daniel shrugged. Would crack sometime. Few relatives laughed before quickly going quiet again. Richard exhaled slowly. His patience was thinning again. Daniel, he said carefully, this isn't a workshop. Daniel nodded. Wood is. This is real money. Yes, millions of dollars. Yes, Richard leaned closer. And you've never managed more than a few thousand. Daniel considered that. That's true. Richard seized the moment. Which means you need guidance. Daniel looked thoughtful. Maybe. Richard relaxed slightly. Good. Daniel looked at Callahan again. Do I have to choose a financial manager today? Callahan shook his head. No. Daniel nodded. Good. Richard frowned. Daniel, I'll think about it. Richard's jaw tightened. Think carefully. Daniel smiled slightly. I usually do, but Richard Mercer wasn't finished. He turned toward Thomas Callahan again. Or something else. Callahan raised an eyebrow. Yes? Richard gestured toward the documents. My mother always believed in discipline. Daniel almost laughed. Richard continued. Are you telling me she placed absolutely no restrictions on how Daniel can spend this money? Callahan paused. Then slowly reached into the briefcase again. There is one final clause. Jason groaned. Of course there is. Richard's eyes narrowed. What is it? Callahan unfolded another document. This clause activates if Daniel experiences pressure from family members. Richard's expression hardened. What kind of pressure? Callahan read the line carefully. Any attempt to manipulate, coerce, or financially influence Daniel's decision results in immediate removal of that individual from the estate property. Several relatives blinked. Jason frowned. You mean kicked out? Callahan nodded. Yes. Allison looked toward her father. Richard's face had gone completely still. Callahan continued. Specifically, Evelyn Mercer wrote, he read the final sentence. If anyone attempts to bully Daniel the way they've bullied him his entire life, they can pack their bags. Daniel blinked. Wait. Callahan closed the document. Yes? That means, Dad could get kicked out of his own house. Every eye in the garden slowly turned toward Richard Mercer. And for the first time in decades, the most powerful man in the Mercer family had absolutely no control over what happened next. For the first time in Daniel Mercer's life, his father had nothing to say. Richard Mercer stood in the garden, surrounded by relatives, the estate house behind him, the fountain trickling quietly in the background. But the balance of power had shifted. 30 minutes ago, Daniel had been the family disappointment, the quiet son, the furniture restorer, the man everyone politely ignored during gatherings. Now he owned the house they were standing in, and the fortune that came. He had built a financial empire from nothing. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. He had outmaneuvered CEOs twice his size. And he was not going to lose control to a man who repaired dining chairs. So he tried one final strategy. He stepped closer to Daniel again. But this time, his voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it. Oh son. The word sounded strange coming from him. Daniel blinked. Richard rarely used it. I think we've gotten off track today. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Have we? Richard nodded. Families fight sometimes. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Allison crossed her arms. Richard continued. But at the end of the day we're still Mercers. Daniel waited. Richard spread his hands. You've always been different. Daniel almost smiled. That's a polite way of putting it. But that doesn't mean we can't fix things. Daniel glanced briefly at the fountain. Funny. Richard frowned. What? That's the second time today someone's talked about fixing things. Richard ignored the comment. What I'm proposing is simple. You keep the trust. Daniel nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. And you keep the estate. Daniel nodded again. So far so good. Richard leaned closer. But you allow Mercer Financial to manage the assets. There it was again. The circle closing. The same plan. Just dressed in softer language. Daniel watched his father quietly. And in return? He asked. Richard smiled slightly. In return, we welcome you properly into the family business. Jason looked confused. Allison's head snapped up. What? Richard continued. You'll have an office downtown. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I don't want an office. We'll have a title. I don't want a title. You'll be respected. Daniel smiled gently. I already am. Richard's patience cracked slightly. Daniel, you mean respected by you. The words landed heavily. Richard stopped talking, because that was the real offer. Not money, not management, validation, approval. The one thing Daniel had never received growing up. Daniel looked around the garden, at his cousins, at Jason, at Allison, at the house he had suddenly inherited. Then he looked back at his father. You know something funny? Daniel said. Richard waited. When I was 12, Daniel pointed toward the large oak tree near the fountain. Old Dewey treehouse over there. Jason blinked. I remember that. Daniel nodded. You told me it looked crooked. Jason shrugged. It did. Daniel smiled. Dad said something different. Richard stiffened slightly. Daniel continued. He said if I wasn't going to build it properly, I shouldn't build it at all. The relatives listened quietly. Daniel shrugged. So I tore it down. Richard looked uncomfortable now. That was 20 years ago. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Then he said something very calmly. That was the last thing I ever tried to build here. The garden fell silent again. Richard exhaled slowly. You're still holding on to childhood grudges. Daniel shook his head. No, he gestured toward the estate. I just stopped building things where they weren't wanted. Richard stared at him. So what happens now? Daniel looked at Thomas Callahan, then back at the house, then at the family, and finally at his father. You really want to know? Richard nodded. Yes. Daniel smiled. Okay. He stood up from his chair, and walked toward the fountain. Everyone watched him. Even Callahan. Daniel placed his hands in his pockets, then turned back toward the group. You're right about one thing, Dad. Richard frowned slightly. What's that? This house is expensive to maintain. Richard nodded. Exactly. Daniel pointed at the estate behind them. And, honestly, I don't want it. The entire garden froze. Jason sat up. Wait. What? Allison blinked. Did he just say? Richard stared at him. You don't want the estate? Daniel shook his head. No. Jason looks. Why not? Daniel smiled. Because I already have a house. He pulled out his phone, and showed them a photo. A small workshop. Brick walls, sunlight through dusty windows, wood shavings on the floor. Shelves filled with restored furniture. My shop? He slid the phone back into his pocket. That place actually means something to me. Richard stared at him. You're giving this up? Daniel shrugged. Not exactly. He looked toward Callahan. Can the estate be sold? Callahan nodded slowly. Yes. Daniel nodded. Good. Jason leaned forward. Daniel, that property is worth millions. What are you? No. Richard narrowed his eyes. What are you planning? Daniel smiled slightly. The same thing Grandma did. Everyone leaned closer. What does that mean? Allison asked. Daniel pointed toward the oak tree again. Grandma used to tell me something when I was fixing furniture. Let me guess. Daniel grinned. Broken things can be repaired. Callahan smiled faintly. Daniel nodded. So here's what I'm going to do. The entire family leaned forward now. I'm selling the estate. Gasps erupted again. And I'm using the money to start something. Richard folded his arms. Mr. Dirabigsa. Daniel looked around the garden. At all of you. Then he said the last thing anyone expected. Restoration school. Jason blinked. For furniture? Daniel shook his head. For people? Nobody spoke. Daniel continued. Places like this used to be built by people who knew how to make things. Callahan listened quietly. Daniel continued. And there are thousands of people out there who just need someone to show them how. He shrugged. Grandma believed in repairing things. Richard stared at him. You're spending millions teaching people how to fix chairs? Daniel smiled. Tables too. A few cousins laughed. Even Jason cracked a smile. Richard shook his head slowly. You're throwing away an empire. But I think Grandma would like it. Callahan nodded once. I believe she would. Daniel looked back at his father one final time. You spent your whole life building things that make money. Richard didn't answer. Daniel continued. I'm going to build something that makes people. And with that, Daniel Mercer walked away from the garden. Not as the family disappointment. Not as the quiet son, but as the one Mercer who had finally learned something the rest of them never had. That the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you own, they're the ones you restore.